For 3 years, a family waited for an answer that never came. 3 years of empty roads, silent mountains, and a home that never felt whole again. And then, on September 22nd, 2023, deep in the rugged stretch of Moffett, Colorado, something was uncovered that no one expected to find there. It wasn't near her home. It wasn't near the bike path. It wasn't even inside the massive search radius investigators had spent thousands of hours covering. It was 50 miles away, in a place no one ever looked, and no one ever had reason to search. Her remains. Suzanne Morphew. Missing since Mother's Day 2020. A case that gripped the entire country and turned her husband Barry into the focus of a 2-year investigation. An investigation that raised questions, exposed secrets, and left a trail of shifting stories that never seemed to match the evidence. But the moment Suzanne was found, far from everywhere authorities were so sure she would be, everything changed. Because the search for the truth did not end with the discovery of her body. It only forced one question to the surface. If Suzanne was never where everyone believed, then who placed her here? And how many people were wrong from the very beginning? Before the headlines, before the theories and the courtroom debates, there was just Suzanne. A daughter, a sister, a friend, a mother of 2 girls who adored her. She was born on April 11th, 1971, in Indiana, and from the very beginning, she carried a quiet strength that everyone around her noticed. She grew up in a home filled with love, laughter, and the kind of warmth that stays with you. Those who knew her never forgot her kindness. She was thoughtful. She was patient. The type of person who remembered birthdays, checked in on people who were struggling, and made room in her life for anyone who needed it. In high school, Suzanne met a boy named Barry Morphew. He was athletic, confident, well-liked. She was drawn to his drive. He was drawn to her heart. What started as a teenage connection became a relationship that carried on after graduation, and after 6 years together, they married. Their life began with promise. Barry pursued professional baseball, signing with the Toronto Blue Jays organization. Suzanne earned a degree in education, excited to build a future centered on family and stability. But life, as it often does, shifted. A serious injury ended Barry's athletic path before it fully started. Suzanne began teaching. Barry turned to landscaping and horticulture. They adapted, as young couples do. And when their daughters, Mallory and Macy, were born, everything seemed to settle into place. The family built a comfortable life in Indiana, tight-knit, active in church, well-known in their community. But beneath that comfort, Suzanne faced something far heavier. She was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. Not once but twice. She fought through every round of treatment with a strength that impressed even the people closest to her. She survived both battles and came out on the other side ready to live more fully than ever before. After years of routines, responsibilities, and the toll of illness, the Morphew family made a decision, one that would mark the beginning of the most important chapter in this story. They left Indiana behind and moved to the mountains of Colorado. A fresh start, a more open landscape, a chance to breathe again. They bought a 7-acre property surrounded by nature, a place where Barry could hunt, where Suzanne could ride her mountain bike, where their daughters could grow into their own dreams. On the outside, it looked peaceful. A new beginning for a family who had earned it. No one could have known that this move, which seemed to offer freedom and healing, would instead set the stage for one of the most perplexing cases Colorado had ever seen. When the Morphews arrived in Colorado in 2018, everything appeared to be falling into place. Their home sat on a stretch of land framed by mountains, pine trees, and the kind of wide-open sky Suzanne had always dreamed of. It was peaceful, quiet, a place where life felt a little simpler. Barry kept working as a contractor. He volunteered as a firefighter. He hunted in the nearby woods and spent hours outdoors. Suzanne stepped away from teaching and devoted more time to her church community. She took up mountain biking. She explored the trails. She found new friendships, new routines, and moments of calm that had been hard to come by during her health struggles. From the outside, it was everything a family could ask for. 2 daughters thriving, a dream property, a marriage nearing 3 decades, beautiful pictures posted online, smiles at church gatherings, a home filled with all the signs of success. But privately, the story was different. Those close to Suzanne would later describe a woman who was trying to hold her family together while quietly carrying the weight of a marriage that no longer felt stable. She had begun to write down her thoughts, her worries, and her fears, entries saved in her phone, tucked away where no one else could see them. In those notes, she spoke about control. about arguments that never seemed to end, about attempts to take her phone, about drinking, about moments that left her unsettled, unsure, and increasingly isolated. She wrote that she felt unheard, that she felt trapped, that the love she once knew had changed into something she no longer recognized. And yet she stayed, for her daughters, for the hope that things would improve, for the belief that after everything she had overcome, illness, uncertainty, upheaval, her marriage could overcome the distance forming between them. But by early 2020, that distance had grown into something she could no longer ignore. She confided in friends. She reflected on the life she had built. She wondered if starting over meant more than just moving across states. And then, quietly, she reconnected with someone from her past. A man she had known years earlier. A familiar voice in a life that suddenly felt anything but familiar. Their conversations grew more frequent. Their messages more personal. For Suzanne, it was not simply an affair. It was an escape, an emotional refuge from a home that felt less like a partnership and more like a place where she had to tread carefully. By the time spring arrived in Colorado, the life Suzanne was living, and the life she was sharing privately through texts, notes, and messages, no longer matched. She was planning to make changes. She was considering what came next. She was asking herself how much longer she could stay. And then came May 2020, a weekend that should have been filled with love, celebration, and family. A weekend meant to honor her. A weekend that ended instead with silence, and a disappearance that still haunts Colorado to this day. May 10th, 2020. Mother's Day. A day that should have been filled with messages, laughter, and familiar routines. Instead, it became the last day anyone heard from Suzanne Morphew. The weekend began quietly. Barry left early for what he described as a landscaping trip in Broomfield, 3 hours from their home. Their daughters were away on a camping trip, and for the first time in months, Suzanne had the house to herself. She spent the morning texting her high school friend, Jeff, the man she had been confiding in for more than a year. Their messages were frequent, warm, and hopeful. At 2:10 p.m., she sent him a selfie. A quiet moment, a small gesture, and the very last time her phone would ever communicate with the world. From that moment forward, silence. Her daughters tried to reach her later that evening, simple messages celebrating Mother's Day. Messages that should have been answered within seconds. Suzanne was known to be active online, always quick to respond. But the hours passed. The notifications stayed unread, and the silence grew heavier. As the evening settled in, concern turned into worry. The girls contacted a neighbor, asking if she could check on their mother. When she arrived, the Morphew house was still. No lights on, no footsteps, no movement from inside. She called Barry. He was already on the road back home, and he told her something that would become one of the most questioned moments in this entire case. He said, "Check the bike." To the neighbor, it seemed like an odd detail to focus on. But she looked, and when she didn't see it, she contacted law enforcement. Deputies arrived soon after and began searching the surrounding area. Hours into that search, they found it, Suzanne's mountain bike, lying down a steep embankment, not far from the property. At first glance, it looked like a possible accident. But the closer investigators looked, the more the pieces refused to fit. There were no skid marks, no damaged vegetation, no blood. The bike itself was in near-perfect condition. Nothing about the scene resembled a fall or a crash. Everything about it suggested placement. When they shared their findings with Barry, his reaction raised even more questions. He offered a theory, one that would soon become widely discussed, widely criticized, and widely doubted. For investigators, this was the beginning, the moment when a missing person case began shifting into something far more complex. By the time Barry and his daughters arrived home, the sun had already set behind the mountains. Search teams moved through the woods. Flashlights cut through the darkness. And for the first night, no one could understand why Suzanne, a woman who never went far without her phone, had vanished without a trace. But as investigators pushed deeper into the following hours, and into the digital footprints left behind, Suzanne's final day would become anything but simple. Because what happened on May 10th wasn't just a disappearance. It was the beginning of a trail of contradictions, missing explanations, and movements that did not match the story that had been shared. In the hours after Suzanne was reported missing, investigators began tracing every detail of her final known day. But instead of clarity, what they uncovered were pieces that refused to settle into place. The mountain bike, carefully positioned rather than damaged from a fall, was only the beginning. Not long after, search teams uncovered another item 1 mile from the Morphew home: Suzanne's bike helmet. It wasn't discovered along a trail she regularly used. It wasn't found in the direction of a typical ride. Instead, it lay in an area that investigators could not connect to her routine, her habits, or the timeline her family had described. The discovery raised an unsettling question. If Suzanne had gone for a bike ride, why were her belongings showing up in the wrong places? When investigators brought this to Barry, his explanation only deepened their concern. He suggested that a mountain lion may have attacked her. But the scene told a different story. There were no signs of an animal struggle. No torn clothing. No blood. Nothing disturbed on the ground where the bike was found. The area was clean, as if someone had placed the items with intention. And then, investigators began examining Barry's movements more closely. They reviewed the data from his truck, expecting to find a straightforward route from his home to Broomfield. Instead, they found something else entirely. Just before dawn, his truck didn't head straight toward the job site. It moved west, 1 mile in the opposite direction, a direction that aligned with the location of Suzanne's helmet. Barry later told investigators he went out to look for elk, but he had also told them he was asleep at that time. 2 stories, 2 timelines, and neither matched what the data showed. Meanwhile, his phone activity revealed something even more unusual. On the afternoon before Suzanne vanished, it registered erratic patterns around the property, movements that lasted only seconds at a time, scattered across the yard, the driveway, and the outside perimeter of the house. When questioned, Barry claimed he had been shooting chipmunks with tranquilizers, a detail investigators found odd and increasingly hard to accept. The more they looked, the stranger the pieces became. On the morning of May 10th, his phone had been placed in airplane mode for nearly 7 hours. His co-workers revealed he wasn't scheduled to be in Broomfield that day at all. The project he said he needed to inspect wasn't set to begin for another week. And surveillance footage captured him disposing of multiple bags of trash at random locations: at the hotel, near McDonald's, behind convenience stores. More stops than his story explained. More trips than a man simply cleaning out his truck. By now, investigators felt a shift occurring. What began as a search for a missing woman was slowly becoming an examination of the one person whose timeline, reactions, and explanations didn't match the evidence. Barry's stories changed. His details shifted. His answers conflicted with the physical world around him. And yet, they still didn't have the key piece. There was no body, no confirmed crime scene, no direct evidence tying anyone to Suzanne's disappearance. But investigators had a sense, a strong sense, that the story being told publicly was far from the story recorded in the data. As they pushed deeper into digital footprints, private messages, and hidden documents, they would soon discover that Suzanne had been keeping secrets of her own. Secrets that would turn this case from a confusing disappearance into a full-scale investigation with a motive, one that no one saw coming. As investigators dug deeper into Suzanne's disappearance, they began searching for answers not in the forest, not along the trails, but inside the one place where people's truths rarely stay hidden: their phones, their messages, and the thoughts they record when no one is watching. What they found inside Suzanne's digital life revealed a woman who was carrying far more than anyone around her knew. Her notes were filled with raw honesty, moments of fear, moments of frustration, and moments where she questioned the very foundation of her marriage. She wrote about arguments, about raised voices, about attempts to take her phone, about nights where she felt unsafe. She wrote about patterns she recognized but could no longer ignore. And then there was something else. Something investigators never expected. Suzanne had been in a relationship with a man from her past, a man she had known decades earlier. What began as simple conversation had grown into something far more emotional, far more meaningful, and far more revealing. Their messages stretched over a year. Plans for the future. Moments of comfort. Conversations she couldn't have at home. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't someone passing through her life. He had become the person she turned to when her marriage felt like a place where her voice no longer mattered. On May 9th, the day before she vanished, Suzanne messaged him more than 50 times. She sent him a photo around 2:10 p.m. It was casual, relaxed, a small moment of normalcy. And then nothing. Her phone never sent another message. No calls. No browsing. No activity at all. Investigators traced her last digital footprint to that exact moment. What happened between 2:10 p.m. on May 9th and the morning of May 10th remained completely dark. But inside the Morphew home, investigators found even more signs that something was deeply wrong. A dart cap from Barry's tranquilizer gun inside the family dryer. A spent bullet casing near the bedroom. A crack in the door frame large enough to suggest force. And remnants of what they believed to be Suzanne's journal, burned inside the fireplace. To investigators, these weren't random fragments. They were pieces of a story, one that pointed to tension inside the home long before Suzanne disappeared. But the most telling piece of all was a note Suzanne had written just 2 days before she vanished. In it, she described an accusation. Barry had confronted her, suggesting she had a boyfriend. The timing of that note, and the silence that followed on her phone, did not go unnoticed. For investigators, the puzzle pieces were beginning to settle into a shape they had suspected from the start. The marriage was breaking down. Suzanne was preparing for change. And someone in that home may have known it. But as powerful as these discoveries were, they still faced a complication. A challenge that every investigator dreads. Every clue they uncovered, every detail they pieced together, the motives, the movements, the contradictions remained circumstantial. And without a body, there was no way to confirm what happened in Suzanne's final hours. No way to determine where she went. No way to understand why her phone went silent at 2:10 p.m. No way to know whether those final moments unfolded inside the home, outside it, or somewhere no one had searched. Suzanne's digital truth gave investigators a direction. But they still needed something more. Something physical. Something undeniable. Something that turned suspicion into certainty. And as they soon learned, the answer wasn't buried in the mountains near the Morphew house. It was miles away, hidden in a place no one thought to look. By late May 2020, the investigation into Suzanne's disappearance had shifted. What began as a search across mountains, rivers, and rugged terrain was now becoming something far more focused. The evidence, the timelines, the digital records, every path investigators followed seemed to circle back to one person, Barry Morphew. Yet despite the growing concern, investigators knew they had to move carefully. Suspicion was not enough. Assumptions were not enough. They needed proof. Something they could stand behind in court. Something that couldn't be explained away. So they went deeper. They examined Barry's truck data hour by hour, learning that on the night of May 9th, when he claimed he was asleep beside Suzanne, his vehicle recorded over 80 door openings and closings between 3:25 and 3:48 a.m. These movements didn't match his story. They didn't match a man who said he went to bed early and didn't wake until morning. They matched someone preparing, loading, moving, adjusting. The next morning, before sunrise, the truck moved again. Not toward the job site he claimed he needed to inspect. Not toward the highway. Instead, it moved west, toward the same direction where Suzanne's helmet was later found. A detail the data captured clearly, but his explanation never fully addressed. At 4:30 a.m., Barry said he left for Broomfield, where he spent the day cleaning his truck, throwing away trash, and walking in and out of the hotel. Surveillance footage caught him making multiple trips to dumpsters, carrying bags investigators would never recover. 5 separate stops. 5 separate disposals. When asked about it, Barry said he simply didn't want to pay extra disposal fees. Inside the hotel, a co-worker reported a sharp smell of bleach. Investigators later discovered Barry changed clothes several times throughout the day, another detail he never mentioned in his interviews. One by one, inconsistencies appeared. Small at first, then larger, then impossible to ignore. His phone, in airplane mode for 7 hours. The timing of his movements. His shifting explanations. The lack of a legitimate work assignment in Broomfield. The claim that he didn't know the job wasn't scheduled to begin until the following week, something his co-workers contradicted immediately. Then there was the moment investigators questioned him about the last day he claimed to have spent with Suzanne. He spoke about a peaceful afternoon. A hike. A steak dinner. Time together. A night that ended calmly and lovingly. But inside the home, investigators found only one dirty plate. Only one dish used. And no signs that the evening had unfolded the way he described. For investigators, this wasn't about one inconsistency. It was about all of them. The timeline that shifted each time new evidence was found. The explanations that never stayed the same. The details that unraveled with every question. By the summer of 2020, the focus of the investigation had narrowed. The searches, the interviews, the warrants. More than 70 investigators poured over 1,000 hours into one goal: finding the truth about what happened to Suzanne. In April of 2021, nearly 1 year after she vanished, prosecutors decided they had enough. Even without a body, even without direct physical evidence, they believed the collection of digital footprints, discarded items, emotional motives, and shifting accounts formed a pattern that spoke louder than any single piece on its own. On May 5, 2021, Barry Morphew was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of his wife. For many, it felt like the case had finally turned a corner. For others, the questions were only growing larger. Because the moment Barry was taken into custody, the most complicated chapter of this case was about to begin. And what came next would shake the entire investigation, from the courtroom, to the public, to the very foundation of the case investigators had spent a year building. When Barry Morphew was brought into the courtroom in the summer of 2021, many believed the case had reached its turning point. After a year of searching, questioning, and gathering evidence, it felt as though investigators had finally pieced together a clear picture. A failing marriage, a silent phone, strange movements in the early morning hours, a bike placed on a ravine, and a husband whose explanations shifted with every question. But inside the courtroom, confidence met resistance. The prosecution laid out their theory. They believed Suzanne was killed on the afternoon of May 9th. They believed Barry used a tranquilizer dart, removed her body, and transported it inside his truck during the early morning hours. They pointed to the truck door openings, the phone in airplane mode, the disposal of trash throughout Broomfield, and the inconsistencies in his account as evidence of a cover-up. It was a story that seemed to fit the digital trail. But the defense understood something critical. The absence of physical proof created space for doubt. Cadaver dogs had not detected the scent of human remains in Barry's truck, or in the hotel room where he allegedly dismembered her body. No blood, no trace evidence, no signs of cleanup. The dart gun investigators believed could have played a role wasn't operational at the time. And photographs of the dryer, where a tranquilizer cap had been found, showed inconsistencies in the way the evidence appeared across different images. The defense pressed each point carefully, chipping away at the foundation of the prosecution's timeline. But then, an unexpected moment shifted the courtroom entirely. It came from a piece of evidence collected early in the investigation: DNA found inside Suzanne's Range Rover. A partial profile. At first, insignificant. But when tested, that DNA didn't match Barry. It didn't match anyone in the Morphew family. It matched profiles from 3 separate, unsolved sexual assault cases, 2 in Arizona, 1 in Chicago. Cases involving a man with a violent criminal history. A man who was never interviewed, never tracked, never considered. A man the investigators never told the defense about. The courtroom fell silent as this information surfaced for the first time. Even Barry's attorneys had never seen it. The lead investigator responsible for following the DNA trail had gone on military leave. The evidence was never examined further. It was never disclosed. It sat in the files of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for months, untouched. For the defense, it became their strongest argument. If the DNA inside Suzanne's vehicle matched a criminal with a history of violence, how could anyone be certain they were looking at the right person? The judge listened. The prosecution pressed forward. The defense continued pushing back on the missing body, the lack of physical evidence, the missteps, the unanswered questions. And when the preliminary hearing ended, it left the courtroom with a divide. One side believed the story of a husband pushed to the edge. The other believed the case had too many holes to stand. The judge ruled that the case could move forward, but the damage was already done. Confidence had cracked, certainty had thinned, and the prosecution now faced an uphill battle, one shaped by evidence they had built and evidence they had overlooked. Barry posted bail on September 20th, 2021, just days before his trial was set to begin. But in a case filled with twists, none would be more dramatic than what happened next. A decision that would force the entire investigation to pause and leave Suzanne's family waiting once again for answers that seemed constantly out of reach. As the trial approached, the tension around the Morphew case reached its peak. Over 70 investigators had spent thousands of hours gathering pieces of a story they believed would lead to justice for Suzanne. But when the courtroom doors finally opened, the foundation they had built began to crumble, first quietly, then all at once. In the months leading up to the trial, the prosecution missed key deadlines. Important witnesses, 14 of them, were suddenly removed from the witness list by court sanction. Evidence that investigators had hoped to present was no longer admissible. Even the timeline that prosecutors relied on began to lose its clarity under scrutiny. The DNA issue, the undisclosed matches, the oversight, these were not small mistakes. They were mistakes that altered the trajectory of the entire case. Then came the moment that changed everything. 9 days before the trial was set to begin, the prosecution made a decision that stunned the entire country. They filed a motion to dismiss all charges against Barry Morphew, not with finality but without prejudice, a decision that allowed them to reopen the case at any time, should new evidence emerge. For the public, it was a shock. For Suzanne's family, it was a heartbreak. For Barry, it was a moment he would never forget. Cameras captured him leaving the courthouse with a smile, flanked by his daughters, walking into the daylight with every charge against him erased, at least for now. The district attorney pointed to the missing body, the overwhelming uncertainty around the DNA, the procedural errors, the sanctions that removed crucial witnesses, and the ongoing investigation that required more time. Without Suzanne's remains, proving what happened, where it happened, and how it happened, was nearly impossible. But for many watching, it felt like the case had slipped through the cracks of its own complexity. 2 years of work, dozens of search warrants, hundreds of interviews, hours of vehicle data, digital records, physical searches, phone analysis, and still no answers. No trial. No justice. A case that had once felt close to resolution was now stalled in silence. The dismissal didn't clear Barry in the eyes of the investigators. It didn't close the file. It didn't end the questions surrounding his movements, his explanations, or his contradictions. But legally, he walked away with nothing hanging over him. The community waited. Suzanne's family waited. And investigators, frustrated, uncertain, and still without a body, waited too, hoping that somewhere, somehow, a breakthrough would appear. But what none of them knew was that the breakthrough had already begun, miles away, underground, in a forgotten stretch of Colorado land. A place no one had ever searched. Suzanne was there, and months later, she would finally be found. And when she was, the entire case would shift again. For 3 years, the mountains surrounding the Morphew home stood untouched by answers. Search teams had combed through forests, riverbeds, and steep ravines. Helicopters scanned the terrain. Divers searched reservoirs. Cadaver dogs tracked every inch of land investigators pointed them toward. But Suzanne was nowhere near any of it. She was far beyond the search radius. Far beyond the places investigators believed she could be. Far beyond the boundaries built by timelines, maps, and assumptions. On September 22, 2023, everything changed. During a separate investigation, one that had nothing to do with Suzanne, agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation were searching a remote patch of land in Moffett, Colorado. A dry, rugged area, miles from major roads. A place so isolated that nobody had ever connected it to Suzanne's disappearance. And that's where they found it. A shallow grave. And inside it, fragments of a life that had once been full of hope, family, and quiet resilience. Bones. Personal markers. Pieces of a woman who had survived cancer twice, fought for her daughters, and tried to rebuild a life in the Colorado mountains. Dental records confirmed what investigators already feared. It was Suzanne. And with that confirmation, everything the investigators believed they knew was suddenly placed under a new light. Suzanne was found more than 50 miles from the Morphew home. 50 miles in the opposite direction of every search. 50 miles outside the pattern of Barry's vehicle data on the 9th and 10th of May. 50 miles from the areas canvassed by hundreds of volunteers. A location so unexpected that it forced everyone to ask the same question. How did she get there? Investigators retraced every mile of Barry's truck movements. They studied every data point again. Nothing showed him in Moffett on the days surrounding her disappearance. If he transported her, how did he reach a location he was never tracked to? If he had help, who would have been capable of navigating such remote ground without being seen? As investigators processed the area, another detail emerged, one that shifted the conversation once again. The location where Suzanne was found had the characteristics of what law enforcement often calls a boneyard, a place where bodies are left, often in shallow graves, often by repeat offenders. A place associated with patterns, not isolated acts. And when paired with the DNA found earlier in her vehicle, DNA linked to a man connected to unsolved sexual assaults in other states, the possibility investigators had once dismissed began to grow louder. Was Suzanne the victim of a stranger? Of someone passing through Colorado? Of an offender with a history that crossed state lines? Barry's attorneys wasted no time building this narrative. They argued that Suzanne may have been one of many victims, that the investigators had been so focused on Barry that they overlooked the possibility of a far more dangerous individual moving through the region. But even with this new discovery, the questions only multiplied. There was no phone data to explain how Suzanne arrived in Moffat. No video, no vehicle trail, no eyewitnesses, no digital signals, nothing tying her presence to a specific person or a specific route. Her body gave answers, and at the same time, it raised far more. For the investigators, this discovery was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would require revisiting every assumption, every lead, and every detail they once believed to be certain. Suzanne was finally found, but the truth of how she reached that place remained missing. The discovery of Suzanne Morphew's remains should have brought closure. It should have provided answers, direction, and certainty. But instead, it opened the door to the most difficult chapter of this case, the one where the only thing more powerful than the evidence is the absence of it. 3 years after her disappearance, investigators finally had Suzanne. But they didn't have a cause of death. They didn't have a confirmed timeline. They didn't have a clear route explaining how she reached Moffat. And they didn't have a suspect whose movements matched the location where she was found. Barry's attorneys seized the moment. They declared him a wronged man. A father who lost his wife, was publicly blamed, arrested, charged, and forced to defend himself in a case they now believed was built on assumptions rather than certainty. They pointed again to the foreign DNA. They pushed the idea of a stranger, a traveler, a drifter, or even a repeat offender using remote areas of Colorado as dumping grounds. They criticized the investigation, the missed leads, the overlooked evidence, the premature conclusions. And they built a lawsuit, $15 million, against nearly everyone involved in Barry's arrest. Barry himself returned to the public eye after his release. He walked out with his daughters at his side, holding on to the belief that he had been targeted unfairly, that the system had failed him, that he had paid the price for an investigation that never looked beyond the boundaries of its own assumptions. But for investigators, the case isn't closed. The district attorney has been clear. Suzanne's death is still under active review. The files remain open. The leads remain open. And the possibility of new charges, whether against Barry or someone else, still exists. Suzanne's family continues to grieve, caught between hope and heartbreak. Her brother still speaks up, still pushes for answers, still searches for clarity in a case that has felt like a maze from the very beginning. Her daughters, now older, have been through the unimaginable, losing their mother, watching their father stand accused, and then watching the entire case collapse in court before it ever reached a verdict. Today, the truth of what happened to Suzanne remains suspended in uncertainty. A marriage marked by tension, a timeline marked by contradictions, a discovery marked by distance, a case marked by missed opportunities and unanswered questions. Someone knows what happened in those final hours. Someone knows how Suzanne left her home, where she went, and how she ended up 50 miles away in the Colorado desert. Someone knows whether her last moments were connected to the man she married, or to someone she never saw coming. Until that truth is found, Suzanne's story remains unfinished. A reminder of how quickly a life can disappear, and how difficult it can be to uncover what truly happened in the quiet hours of a single May weekend. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.